going to time myself. I'm going to put it here. All right. Hello, everybody. Feel funny as you're all talking and having a chance to breathe. I'll take up your space and talk a little bit. And I feel very humbled to be here. And thank you, Chem and TCVI, for having me here today and for welcoming onto here to this land, this place, Treaty 8. I come up from Treaty 6 yesterday with my colleague Tiffany from the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee. And I also thank you to the Cold Lake First Nations for hosting this. It's nice to be out in this space. So I feel a bit humbled because as I sit in this room, it occurs to me that many of you know rights. You know rights, I think probably better than most in Canada, and I don't even want to use that in Turtle Island. So I feel a bit humbled coming up here. I'll share what I have to know. I've been working at the John Humphrey Centre for 15 years, and the work continues to evolve and grow and develop. So how do I shift it? Just all right. So Cam did talk a little bit this morning about human rights, the League of Nations coming out and about, and really the most kind of critical point in history around human rights is around 1948, kind of post-World War II, where we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which happened at the United Nations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights really, we could talk about all the reasons why it came about. It came about post-World War II. To deal with the many issues that we saw in the world and people thinking we never wanted to see that again. But I think many of us would argue, even internationally, that the situation of human rights is just the same, if not worse, as it was back then. But what's important about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is it really gives us this framework of these articles of what we all need to live for a life of well-being and to achieve our full potential. So human rights is meant to be this holistic concept where it's about the whole person and what a whole person needs to be able to live well. So a lot of people, when they think about rights, they think about voting or they think about, the law system, but it's actually so much more than that. It's about, the right to shelter, the right to food, and all these other things. And that was kind of what the logic was around the Declaration. And so, but the important thing to note, but when there's a declaration at the international level, a declaration is not an internationally legally binding document. So we've talked about a lot today about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, for example. In reality, that's not an internationally legally binding document yet. It's pretty actually incredible that there is movement on instilling the Declaration into law in Canada, even though it's not in international law yet. And I think it shows a progression of things, and BC kind of leading up the fight there. But the other piece is that these declarations, they become international law when they become conventions. So we had in 1966, it took 18 years for the Universal Declaration to become international law, when we had the International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights, and then we had the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which were instilled. It was in 1966 where we finally had kind of these internationally legally binding laws which we could hold our states to account. So while these declarations are more principled documents that we strive for, these conventions are the ones that become those laws that we can use as tools for accountability. And I think that's the most important thing to think about for human rights, is they are tools for us to demand accountability for government, against the state. And I just want to say, it was interesting this morning that thought about where do we fit in? When we look at the most valuable thing about using the human rights discourse is that you fit in everywhere. When you look at the Indian Act, really in 1869, which was pre-Confederation, this was part of as you all know, part of a larger genocidal project for Canada. It was a major departure from that nation-to-nation relationship, and it was really focused on the erasure of the status of women as well as two-spirited people. Women, as I know, in many of the communities across Turtle Island, were the heart of the community, and there was a real intentional reason and focus of why women became segregated and erasured through the Indian Act. There's a reason for that, the two-spirit as well. So it created this kind of binary of gender, but it also created an inferior legal status. It allowed Canada to create that inferior legal status, which we're struggling with today. and all the conversations that exist. And it was interesting, the conversation this morning too, because we will talk a little bit more about these mechanisms that exist at the UN to affect change. But the changes that happen with the Indian Act, like Steve talked about this morning, Bill C-31 in 1985, that shift that started to happen in the Indian Act around gender discrimination was a result of Sandra Lovelace, is one of the key cases, going up to the United Nations and pushing and saying the Indian Act is discriminatory. And it was she fought at the United Nations from 1977 to 1981. And the United Nations clearly said, yes, the Indian Act is clearly discriminatory against women. And it was at that point where Canada had to start looking at the Indian Act and had to start shifting. And that's why you saw it in C-31 in 1981. And now we see the McIver fight at the international level as well to push it forward, because we don't have a lot of spaces in Canada to seek remedy around these acts that are violating human rights. All right. So, what I want to say when we think about human rights, the human rights language is very much, when you read a convention, it says every article states, state parties shall. So it's this idea that states have a responsibility to fulfill the rights that are enshrined within these conventions. So when Canada signs on to a convention, such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we make a legal commitment to enshrine all those rights within the Charter of the Rights of the Child, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, whether that's education, whether it's health care, whether it's food security. So these are legal commitments that Canada makes when they agree to a convention. When they ratify it, they agree that we will strive to continue to improve and strengthen human rights as they move forward. And so these make them really important documents for demanding state accountability. And you can see it's ultimately about state responsibility. But at the United Nations, Sharon was talking this morning about presenting to that Committee on the Rights of the Child. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but what's important at the United Nations level is there is a strong need for the United Nations to have feedback from community, from citizens, to be able to see the realities of what is really happening. Because Canada will report to these committees, Canada reports to the United Nations around certain issues, but the United Nations can't see the truth unless people bring their information forward too. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec, but I think what's important to understand about human rights is it's this organic cycle that needs to happen, where there needs to be feedback coming from the people to be able to claim and demand rights for them to become real. Because otherwise state parties won't pay attention. They don't see a need. They're not going to be held legally responsible. So there's this kind of tripartite relationship that exists between state, civil society, and the international community around human rights. And the international community is really this place where we can push and strive. And there have been many instances in Canada where it's like Bill C-31 in the Indian Act around gender discrimination is one example of people within Canada use the UN system to push back and to seek change. So, but the interesting thing I think about the Canadian state is that, and as what's come up today, is there's so many, the biggest challenge I see in Canada around human rights is jurisdiction. The jurisdiction issues around the degradation to different levels of jurisdiction creates all these gaps where people just fall through and there's no responsibility. And when you look at the United Nations or Canada's reports to the United Nations, oftentimes, if it's in the area of health, for example, which we know is a provincial jurisdiction, Canada will just report, yeah, we understand there may be challenges with the health system, but this is under provincial jurisdiction, period. So they don't report anything. So what happens is the amount that gets reported from the state to the UN is missing a lot of critical information because provinces have no place to report. Provinces have no responsibility to be held accountable. There are no national mechanisms that really set standards for any of these international documents to help us achieve them. And this is a really big challenge. But the other kind of challenge that we have in Canada, along with jurisdictions, is the transience of our political system. The movement of an every 4-year cycle, at least in the federal provincial, I know it's 3 years on band, right, is this transition traditional kind of politics never sets us in a course where we're looking long-term with human rights. It's always transactional. It's always transactional, and so it's never deeply embedded into change. So when we talk about human rights, I always like to think about it in 4 kind of critical pillars of human rights. And those pillars are provision, protection, participation, and remedy. And I'll just explain those a little bit more. So when we think about the holism of human rights, these 4 principles are critical in terms of finding balance. The state has a responsibility to provide the necessities of life, and what I mean by that is those things like shelter, food, those kind of things. The state has a responsibility to ensure that they're working towards and continuing to strengthen people's access to those basic things. The protection from the violation of others. Those protection rights are things like, having a legal system where we can charge people if they've assaulted us, for example. We have these spaces we put in place that we protect people from violation of others. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a protection mechanism, but what's important to understand about the Canadian Charter is it is a protection mechanism between me and the state. It's not a protection mechanism between me and you, for example. It is for us to be able to hold the state accountable against abuse. And so it's this really important document for us to understand and use when we're trying to hold the state to account. The third piece is participation. So the other key element about human rights is we all have the right to participate in the decisions that affect us. It could be a child in the school, it could be you in your workplace, it could be in any kind of area, but we all have that right to participate in the decisions. A lot of the conversation that we've had this morning, even about consultation and consent, like consent-free and informed prior consent, that's this piece about participation. At the United Nations, Canada has actually been quite chastised by its practices around consultation, and it's interesting because when I've been thinking about my experience with the Canadian government and how they approach the UN and how they engage with building policy and how they're going into the UN, it's always about more global issues that are happening in other countries. They have tables where civil society organizations come together and they talk about what Canada should be reporting at the United Nations. Never around that table have I seen them be willing to talk about Canadian issues at that table and moving forward, which I find really interesting. So they'll have a bunch of NGOs and they're talking about women's rights, but they're talking about women's rights in Malawi, or they're talking about women's rights in Philippines, but they're not talking about women's rights in Canada. So these consultation processes that we have in place in Canada, the UN has even pointed out, they're very problematic, and Canada kind of fails to hit the boat and really understanding how to engage with community and to allow people to be heard. And then the final piece is remedy. If we do not have spaces to access for remedy of our human rights, then in fact we do not have rights. And this is like a really critical piece of the puzzle, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. I think while we have some tools to claim our rights, we are lacking in a number of areas. And I know legal fees and all that stuff has even come up this morning. The fact that, our access to justice in Canada is a bit of a, I want to say, a farce in some sense. If you don't have money, you don't have access to justice, particularly within the legal system. However, we do have these human rights mechanisms that we can use and we should be using. And that's what's so great about the Sandra Lovelace case, for example, is that going up to the United Nations, not that that didn't cost probably a lot of money over those 4 years of fighting, but it's a space that we can access without having to pay or have a lawyer to do it with us. So the critical piece about these 4 areas, though, is that whether it's a state government, whether it's a municipality, whether it's a school, they should be striving to have balance in provision of human rights in all 4 of these areas. What you'll often find with a government is they tend to be maybe focusing a lot of their energies around the protection and the provision, whereas the participation and the remedy gets lost. So finding a balance, the states have a responsibility to find balance between these 4 areas. Other critical piece is to understand, and I think it's really important to understand, because I often find people will start talking about issues and they'll talk about, under this act we can use this mechanism, or we should go to court and go to the Supreme Court for this issue. What you all need to understand is that human rights is primacy law. So it trumps all other law. And I'm just going to give you an example. So I was working in Edmonton. There was a group of business owners from the African community who were running, pubs and lounges and stuff. But what they were finding is that the level of police engagement in their establishment and their businesses was way over the top. It was way beyond any other pub you would ever see. Just the level of intrusion, and the EPS was going in with their guns. They were very heavily armed. They were kind of harassing the customers, and all these businessmen were losing business. And they're thinking, this is not right. So what was interesting about that was the Edmonton Police Service said, well, under the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission Act, we have the right to be able to go into these private businesses and do this, and to make sure we're scouting things out and making sure everything's okay. When in reality, when you look at the treatment of these African business owners versus another business owner in Edmonton, there was a stark difference. That's what you would call discrimination, is differential treatment of those businesses. And so we worked with those businesses to document these cases and how EPS was coming in, and we went to the commission, the Human Rights Commission. And it was interesting because within a week of us kind of starting to document and make it known, EPS is pulled out of those businesses pretty much altogether. Because they knew they were passing the line. And the most important thing for you to understand is that primacy law. It doesn't matter if you'll find with the Human Rights Commission, they have a lot of barriers in the sense that you have 1 year to file a complaint, for example. Or there's only, you can't get $1 million suit out of the Human Rights Commission. You can tend to get about $10,000. It's minor. However, the most important thing about the Human Rights Commission is when there's a decision that a law violates human rights, it has to change. So human rights law is primacy law. It trumps, and that's really important to understand because I feel like people can often get stuck talking about other acts. Human rights law is primacy law. That's why the Canadian Human Rights Commission around education, Indigenous children and education is really important because the Commission was able to start pushing that agenda forward because nobody else was. And I know it's still kind of going through the processes, but a decision has been ruled, and now the Canadian government has to be held accountable to that decision. And we'll see how that goes. Okay, so when we talk about human rights too, because these are international standards that are set, and because these are international laws, they actually apply to all levels of government. So it trickles down. Human rights, there's an obligation from the international level. As soon as Canada ratifies a convention, Canada then makes a commitment to those legal obligations and has to implement them into policy, laws, legislation. So we have that right. But then the province also has the responsibility to do the same. The municipality has the responsibility to do the same. School boards have the responsibility to do the same. So all of these public spaces, all of these government spaces, and you'll find at the municipal level, for example, particularly, and you'll find in school boards and stuff like that, nobody's talking about human rights unless they're talking about it as a diversity thing. When in fact, all of those governments are responsible and have obligations under these international laws. Many of them don't understand that, but it's a really critical piece. So what I find is that this language, using the language of human rights, can kind of make people pay a little bit more attention. I often find I'll use the human rights language in letters and stuff like that I'll write about issues just to point out, under Canada's commitment of international law, under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we're obligated to do this, I'll say. But this is what's happening, and this is how it's impacting the family. And just an example about that is like I was working with a family who had been here for like 15 years, and the husband all of a sudden got a deportation order, and he was the main income earner for his family. And by deporting this guy, his family was going to end up in severe poverty. I mean, they were already in poverty. We're going to end up homeless, all these issues. So when we broached the subject and we pushed it, we really used the Convention on the Rights of the Child to talk about the problems with, separating families. What's in the best interests of the child, and these sorts of things. And we were able to overturn the decision around his deportation. And I really think that when we use the language of human rights and we really tie it to the fact that we're legally obligated to that, it kind of makes people pay attention a little bit more. And so I think it's really valuable to use. So, sorry, I get really excited when I talk about human rights, so I tend to just... All right. So now, so how do we use human rights? What do we do with human rights? How do we defend human rights? And one of the things to understand too, and I know you all know this, like when you start speaking up about rights, you're not the most favorite person in the room. I tell you, I haven't been a most favorite person in the room, and I've often been excluded from spaces because I apparently agitate too much. So, when we think about human rights, though, we often think about defending human rights, you have to be that rebel. You have to be out there and you have to be like yelling at the front of the protest rallies, but that's not the case. Defending human rights requires so much more. And so when we think about those different ways that we can, use our rights, and the John Humphrey Center, we really try to find balance in our work, but you can advocate, and what that means is we're just using the systems, even though we know they're totally broken, both individually and systemically, to affect change. So this could be, for example, with that case of the gentleman that was deported, we advocated for him individually. However, there's another issue around the health system, which I'll talk about in a little bit, where you're really looking at how do you advocate at a systemic level around things. Another area is documenting and witnessing. I think this is really important. I think witnessing is really important in the sense that sometimes we just need to shift the power balance. So sometimes, for example, if somebody's going to the doctor's office and say they're transgender and they don't feel fully safe in that space, maybe the doctor hasn't listened or heard them, by having a witness being able to go in helps to shift the balance a little bit, helps to have that professional pay a little bit more attention and be accountable for what they're saying because they know they're being observed. And we've often found that situation of just having people witness what's happening in spaces like that is really valuable. We've often done that in the courts as well. I know our team in St. Paul, which I'll talk a bit as well, mobilized some people into the courthouse around that incident with, I think it was with this last month, Ashmont School. So that piece about going into the courtrooms and being present and witnessing what's happening. I know there was in November, we were working on a case against the Canadian Border Service Agency, and it was interesting. We managed to get 60 people into the courtroom around this one case. When the judge walked in, he kind of went, whoa, because he saw a presence of people paying attention to the case, and I think that's really important. But the other critical piece about this is documentation and formal filings of things. I know, particularly with your community, the Indigenous community, you don't file complaints. I get it. You don't trust these systems. What the hell are they going to do anyway? But I will guarantee you, here's an interesting story, and I'm going to give you two stories. One was the Alberta Human Rights Commission. The Alberta Human Rights Commission basically runs their priorities based on what is submitted to them every year. So they'll get about 17,000 complaints every year, and most of them come from people with disabilities. A lot of them come around employment, harassment, or sexual, gender pieces. But Indigenous discrimination doesn't really even hit the radar because nobody files. So it's not registered as a priority for them because nobody's using the system. And while we also may not want to file things because we don't think it's going to go anywhere, sometimes just the importance of having those stats in there is really important. And here's another example. The Alberta Hate Crimes Committee, which I I volunteer with, I'm on the executive, been for a while. But when I started there, I found it really fascinating that the Hate Crime Committee is a coalition of law enforcement and civil society, which is a really challenging partnership, but it's really important. None of the law enforcement officers thought that hate connected to the Indigenous community was an issue because nobody filed hate crime reports, nobody filed hate crime incidents, those kind of things. So this piece about documenting, as much as it sucks sometimes, we have to do it. We have to document what's happening in our communities, because unless it's a stat, often public officials won't pay attention to it. So it's a really critical piece. Third element is facilitating and organizing. I think, part of this is, and as you all know, you organize probably on a daily basis, but we're really creating that space to build that collective strength around human rights is a really critical thing. And then educate, and that's why you're having this today, is this thing is like we can't claim our rights if we don't know what they are. And so that education piece is important. And this is often where I'll say the rebels stand, the ones that stand in front of the rallies and push, because they are the one trying to shine light on these really challenging issues, and we need that, but we also need all those other pieces behind the scenes to shift things. So I think that's really important, and it's understanding that we all have totally different roles within this. And I think maybe some of those of us that are behind the scenes maybe don't feel like we're acknowledged enough in that role, but those that are maybe at the front lines with, really pushing and speaking up, I mean, there's a lot of potential of impact for that, but we're all important in this journey. Okay, so I want to just tell you a little bit maybe more about kind of what we're up to and what we're learning, and just kind of take it from there. I'm trying to get us back on time and get us, so be quick, but one of the projects that we've been working on is called Stride Advocacy. And Stride Advocacy actually really evolved out of the work with St. Paul, with Doreen and the Friendship Center, and that over the years is, we were doing a lot of kind of work coming out and learning. We were bringing the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate out, but what was really obvious is people in the community just really don't even know what to do when something happens. If you go to the emergency clinic and you are treated in a horrible way, what are you supposed to do? What are all these things that we're supposed to do? So over the past couple years, we've been working really hard to try and fill this gap. So what we're doing is we're kind of working to build networks of advocates in different areas of the province. We're really working to kind of help people connect who are doing community-based advocacy, give them the knowledge and tools that they need to be able to help people in their community to advocate, but also kind of build teams around systemic advocacy. So for example, Slave Lake is an example. Slave Lake, I was invited up there about 8 months ago, and we started this Stride Advocacy project up there. And we got a call, it was from Vanderwell Lodge, which is a seniors lodge up there, as well as the Friendship Center. And what they were finding was that kind of post-fire, Slave Lake's health system is totally disaster. It's a disaster. It's not supporting the people that need the support that they need to be able to just have a life, period, have a quality of life. And so what happened is we as a team, there was a team of people there, and we've started working with them to build this capacity. And so we held like a human rights clinic in July, and it was the first time kind of piloting this. And part of this work around human rights is innovating and figuring it out as we go, because there's not a lot of people actively pushing on rights, I don't think. Aside from the long work that the Indigenous community has done, I don't see a lot outside of that. But in St. Paul, we did this clinic, and we were able to collect 49 complaints of people with the health system. And so what we did with that is we started to kind of target our advocacy. So first we submitted it with the Alberta Health Services Patient Relations. That's the first place you're supposed to file a human rights complaint, a health rights complaint. And it was interesting. They said they opened an investigation, but the calls that all the people got back were like, oh yeah, we did the investigation and it's working fine. Okay, so then we submitted them all to the Alberta Human Rights Health Advocate. There's an Alberta Health Advocate which exists to kind of take issues up and push them as well, so we filed them there. And then out of those 49, there were 33 that had a pretty good chance of being a good human rights complaint, and we filed them all as a collective complaint to the Alberta Human Rights Commission earlier this month. So we're just trying to systemically kind of use these human rights remedy spaces to push for this rights, and we're trying to work together to really unearth and document the issues that are happening in Slave Lake and take them to the next level. So that's one example. And then in St. Paul, I think what's been really loud for the team there has been the issues around hate. It has been for a while. And so in October, the team came together and spent some time really thinking about how do we want to build a response to hate in the community. And one of the next things that the team in St. Paul is going to do is on April 15th, we're going to do a bit of a stakeholder gathering to start building some relationships across the stakeholders in St. Paul, so the folks from law enforcement, folks from the justice system, and really kind of create this intentional space where we can build the relationships we need to respond better to what's happening in the community. And this has been something that we've been working on in Edmonton as well, with the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee, where we've realized that one of the barriers to actually addressing the issues in Edmonton is the fact that all the nonprofits hate each other. Nobody wants to work together. Everybody's got their issues. But you can't solve a problem by bringing together people for one day, half a day. Maybe we'll talk about the issues and what's there, but we never get anywhere if we don't have relationships. So, and as much as some of those relationships are hard, we know, to cultivate, we have to do it. So in Edmonton, we're going through this process of 4 stakeholder gatherings. See, there's my timer already. I'm almost done. But in Edmonton, as part of like going through these 4 gatherings, we're seeing after 3 already that people are starting to talk. There's stuff starting to happen, and it's really great to see. But it was hard. We started out that one, and law enforcement walked out in our first stakeholder gathering. So it was a learning right off the get-go. But how do we keep and how do we have constructive spaces where law enforcement and all these stakeholders are at the table, but that they're willing to listen and we build a foundation for change? And that's a really big thing. So in St. Paul, we're really kind of hoping to take that off. And then I'll move, we have teams in about 6 cities throughout the community, but Lethbridge is another really big one, and hate has been a really big one down in Lethbridge as well. And so with them, in Lethbridge, what we've been seeing is that where they're really centering a lot of their energies, although in Lethbridge we're running these clinics where people can kind of come and file complaints, one of the big issues in Lethbridge is sports. The fact that a lot of Indigenous parents and family members are getting criminalized because they're protecting their children. A lot of issues are coming up, and so we're actually doing kind of stakeholder gatherings down there to start building the bridges between the minor hockey leagues and different folks, because honestly, I know maybe that sounds fluffy, but if we can't build foundations for relationship, we're going nowhere. And so that we think that's really important. So that really links to kind of the work, like the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee has been working quite closely with us down in the work in Lethbridge and been coming up now to St. Paul. But I really kind of wanted to hit this little kernel because hate always consistently comes up as a real issue. I know that it's a systemic issue, and it was part of kind of the remnants of our colonial history, I think, as well. But it's a reality. And I know that hate holds people down so much, but I just want to articulate like the difference between a hate crime and a hate incident, just point you in the right direction. So hate crime is a crime. It's a crime motivated by hate. So I could like hit Cam and give him a good smack upside the head. That's an assault. But at the same time, if I was saying, Cam, you stupid ugly man, or something like that, where I was really using something to identify him with a particular group, like racial slur or whatever it was, that would be a crime, but it's motivated by hate, given what I've said. Like vandalism, you can have vandalism, but if it's vandalism that has like a swastika, or some that we've seen have been about Hitler, that is a crime, but it's motivated by hate. So what that means is when the crime is prosecuted, if it's motivated by hate, they can get extended sentencing. So it's not a special category of crime per se. It's a stronger penalization for somebody who does do a hate crime. So really important to understand, if you see a crime happening or if you witness anything that is a crime and you can see those identifiers that it points to hate, do please report it. And I will say to law enforcement, I will say a lot of law enforcement don't really know what to look for when they're investigating hate crime. Not all of them have been trained on what it is or what to look for. There are hate crime units within the RCMP, EPS, Calgary Police, Lethbridge Police, that they can do that, but they're 1 or 2 man teams. So it's really important, if you're going to report something that you think is crime and you think it's motivated by hate, say you think it's motivated by hate and tell them why, because it will help them take that next step in terms of the investigation. Now, then we have a hate incident. And a hate incident is anything that's non-criminal, but is very similar. It's, motivated by hatred. So I could just make a really shitty comment to somebody on the street that's racially motivated. That's an incident. A lot of people wouldn't report hate incidents, but what's important to know about that is it is worth reporting, because oftentimes those who actually end up getting to the point where they commit a hate crime have often done a lot of little things along the way to get to that crime. So if law enforcement has a really hard time prosecuting hate crime, but if they have record and history that somebody has been doing these more or less non-criminal acts, then it's easier for them to be able to prosecute. But we've also realized that it's not fun to go and report to the police all the time. So the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee has set up this website, stophateab.ca, where people can just go on and say, hey, this happened. You can choose to just document it and just leave it at that, or you can ask for follow-up. But we find things get reported and Tiffany will filter them to the right law enforcement agency and they get acted upon right away. So we this partnership and this idea of reporting things is really important and helps us to shift spaces. Okay. So this is I think, maybe the more important slide, and I'll try and be quick on it. I am going to get to my 45 minutes. But this is when we talk about remedy mechanisms, I wanted to point this out. And I know Sharon talked about the Convention Committee this morning, going to the Convention on the Rights of the Child Committee. But at the United Nations, some of the things that you need to know about is there are a few mechanisms there. So there is the UN Human Rights Council, where you can file complaints, like a human rights complaint too. That was like the process that Sandra Lovelace used, that Sharon McIver used, to really bring their individual case forward to the Human Rights Council to push. That Universal Periodic Review, should be in a next point, but the Universal Periodic Review is an interesting process. It's a new process at the United Nations. It started around 2009. And it was a process that started because there was this realization that the UN had created all these different committees on different areas of human rights, migrant rights, women's rights, children's rights, all these different areas. But what happens when we do that is we segregate things, and things don't get heard, or we're not seeing the bigger picture of what's happening in a country. So in 2009, they started this process called the Universal Periodic Review, which is very similar to those convention committees, but it's looking at a country as a whole. It's taking all the reports that are coming into all those different convention committees and looking at them and saying, okay, Canada, these are all the really critical areas you need to really address. And I think what is interesting about the Universal Periodic Review is that a lot of people think, so what about the United Nations? It doesn't work. You've seen some examples today of how it has worked for Canada in relation to gender discrimination in the Indian Act. But the Universal Periodic Review is also this process where things can be highlighted and brought forward and investigated in Canada. So for example, when I say special procedures, I know I go all over the place, and hopefully I make sense, but special procedures are, what these are more called special rapporteurs, if you've heard of them. So special rapporteurs are these individuals at the United Nations who exist to investigate into issues in a country. So for example, when they're doing this Universal Periodic Review, for example, the Special Rapporteur maybe be looking at Canada's issues around Indigenous rights and going, these are all the things that the Canadian government says is they're doing, this is what's working, maybe this is where the gaps. Then they're going to look at, where else do you think they'll get their information? They get their information from civil society. People like, I'm blanking, National Association of Indigenous Women. Yes, Native Women's Association of Canada, I know, submits reports. There's a few organizations in Canada that submit reports to the United Nations, and any of us can do it. By the way, it's like a 4-page report. It's called a shadow report that we can send into a committee and say, look, this is all the things that we're seeing. This is what we think needs to happen. So the Special Rapporteur will look at what civil society is saying, and we'll look at what the government's saying. And if there's a huge gap, then the Special Rapporteur will want to investigate into that case. So one example was James Anaya, who was a Special Rapporteur on Indigenous rights, and he had tried to start coming to Canada since 2008, but he couldn't come until the federal government gave him a formal invite. And what was interesting is it was the day before the Universal Periodic Review, in the second periodic review, which was 2013, that Canada decided to say, oh yeah, James, you can come into our country, and gave him an official invite. It was the day before Canada went to the Universal Periodic Review that they decided that they were going to agree to the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So that Universal Periodic Review process is a little bit of a shaming space, but it's a space that applies pressure and creates some shifts, and it's important to know about, and we can engage with that. I won't go through all of these, but there is a regional Inter-American Commission on Human Rights where we can take complaints as well. I don't know any cases that have went there, though. Then when I say universal jurisdiction, what I mean by that, see, I'm going to go through them because I can't hold back. But universal jurisdiction is this really interesting one where a lot of the Commonwealth countries, well, not all Commonwealth countries, like countries like Germany, South Africa, Canada, New Zealand, some of these countries will actually hear cases from other countries. So for example, if you'll remember Rwanda a number of years ago, perhaps there was a case where a gentleman, one of the perpetrators, landed here in Canada, and he was actually tried in Canadian courts. And used kind of another national court system to hold this gentleman to account. So those are other things that are emerging. There's not a lot of knowledge or practice around universal jurisdiction yet, but it is starting to emerge, which is an interesting thing for us to think about. If you're a victim or if you're a perpetrator and you're in a specific country that has universal jurisdiction, you can use it to sue your own country. At the federal, I've talked about the chart about the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and also at the provincial level, we have the Human Rights Commission here. The Human Rights Commissions are really spaces for us to use when we feel we've been discriminated against. It's really kind of relegated our human rights laws to be only about discrimination, which is a bit of a challenge because human rights is a bit bigger than that. So we have the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Provincial Human Rights Act where we can hold businesses to account. Say we go into a superstore or somewhere and we're treated a certain way and it's pretty obvious that we're being discriminated against, and we can show that, we can file a complaint against these systems. One of my most recent cases was a woman working for a nonprofit down in Lethbridge as the only Indigenous staff person, and being able to articulate what she was experiencing in the workplace, and then submitting it to the Alberta Human Rights Commission, and it holds that nonprofit to account in terms of they have to be aware of what they're doing. There's a challenge that often people who in employment face is that when they submit complaints, they'll often get, there's this retaliation thing that can often happen in the workplace. Within the Alberta Human Rights Act, if an employer does retaliate in any way, they actually can get further fined and burdened. It's against the law to retaliate. Not an easy thing to always get, stop, however. So those commissions are important. We have advocates and mechanisms at the provincial level. We don't have them at the national level. At the national level is where we should always have actually the standards. There should be an office at the national level that's children's rights, for example, that should be setting the standards and monitoring across the country. But we don't have that. Every province is kind of responsible for their own human rights area. But here in Alberta, we have things like the disability advocate, the health advocate, those kind of things. The Office of the Child and Youth Advocate, not all super awesome, but some of them are super awesome. And being able to report to those mechanisms and just file what's happened is really important because it allows them to take it up and advocate. So I will stop that. Okay. So, almost there. So just in closing, I have like 3 kind of quick slides, and obviously this slide is something you know. I think there's many instances along the way where pre-Confederation onwards that there was like this genocidal project. The removal of Indigenous peoples from lands, the fact that you couldn't, raise legal fees, those kind of things, the fact that you couldn't meet in more than groups of 3, the police was really set up to clear the lands. That's one element. But then we look at other communities, and we look at the Black community, for example. And this is knowledge I think I want to share with you, because I think more and more today the most important thing is we need to start working across our communities, because we're all divided and we're all working alone. The Black community is one in particular that I think is really important to hold in that. And if you look, actually 1905 Albertans, the colonizers, fought that Canada should not allow any Black immigration into Canada. That was huge. 1911, we had stuff like Edmonton City Council banning blacks from the city. We had the segregation of schools. All that stuff is really deep. And just like all of these pieces with Indigenous history have an impact on you today, it has an impact on this community today. It was interesting because I was doing a circle down in Lethbridge, and I remember one of the elders, when we were talking about this stuff, she sat back, she went, now I know why I never see the black community. It impacts us all, and we have to recognize that. And I'm just going to end with this one, too, is the queer community. And, you know, when we even look at the Indian Act, you look at these pieces along the way. This piece about gender binaries is really huge, but homosexuality has been criminalized since the get-go. There are instances where there have been so many resources put into finding out who's homosexual and putting them out. There are many cases about that throughout Canadian history, and I think that's really huge. And so in closing, you know, here on Turtle Island, as you all know, we're no stranger to human rights violations. Unfortunately, at the international level, they have that false narrative of Canada as this peace builder, this golden road. It's not reality, but it is embedded in the very foundations of our federal state. And it was built on this idea of exclusion of all peoples. If you look at any people that were not that Christian, white, Western European, a lot of them went through challenges. The Jewish community post-World War II was not welcome into Canada. They weren't granted enfranchisement rights. A lot of these communities along the way, so a lot of our communities have been impacted by this exclusion and this kind of ideology, which we need to be aware of. So these milestones are only just a sample of the innumerable measures, as you guys know, that have really been put in place to oppress. And what I want to leave with is just a reminder of our solidarity with our neighbors. I know these are all individual fights that we're fighting in some ways, but there is potential when we start to come together and work together. And I think we've seen that through that project with Stride, is that in a room of advocates, we have people with disability, we have people from the transgender community, people from the Indigenous community, people from the black community, and when you can work together and not be divided, there's so much more potential there. So, you know, human rights are really the only legal tools. I think human rights are really the only legal tools that we have to fight. They are available and accessible to us for remedy, and I think we really have to use them. You know, when we think that our world is, when we only rely on the political processes and on elected officials to affect change, we're severely missing the boat. Because it's transactional, and it's transient, and it's short term. Advocacy has to be much broader and bigger than that, and I think it's about all of us working broader and bigger than that. So I will just end it with that. Thank you. I can't do it in 30 minutes.
Thank you very much. I did not fall asleep. We worked together in the past, so we can sort of hit each other once in a while. So it's an excellent presentation, but as you can see, if you want a more finite presentation in more detail, you would have to set up your appointments or arrangements with your nations, with Renee, and you can really get down to small steps, and you'll see how she's actually been helping our people in many ways. And she raises a good point, because I know, let's be up front here, all of us sitting here. I'll just use hockey as an example. How many of you and your children have been discriminated and called down at hockey tournaments or hockey games versus Muniaos? And nobody ever reports that.
Yes, we do.
Well, once in a while, but nothing ever happens. So
We have to mobilize that.
so yeah, so that's the point. Yeah. 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 Yeah, and that's actually a prime example of where a lot of racial discrimination takes place. Is that, believe it or not, at hockey games where our children are actually discriminated, and what processes do we have? So,
Community, not just by one individual.
Yeah.
Community is on it.
And the
Good.
seeds that plants.
yes. So what we need to do is you've seen some of the places where you can actually start doing this. If we don't do it, then like you heard from her, if you don't do it, it just gets buried. So in the back to my right, lady, apologize.
Thanks. 6 months ago, I
one restaurant. And then I had filed a report on that town. And I had to, and I was, my gas tank was, it barely made it to the next town, Hannah. And these are the things that we have to
Every day.
try to solve, and it's everything, even the RCMP,
Yep.
that they're not doing their job right through discrimination.
Yep. Yep.
And the mechanisms that you have to complain are usually internal mechanisms that, how can you complain to the police about the police? You have to complain to the police. We need kind of these external spaces of working together.
Well, I did, but there was nothing done.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Dale. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
It's very sad. It's sometimes if you look a certain way, or if you're not able to speak for yourself, if you speak your original language, your Indigenous language, then there's a discrimination that I know that front and center. I can tell you people that. I know that happens all over in the hospitals, but they have within the hospital system, they have a complaint line. And they started it about 4 years ago. And I met a fella and he said that only maybe 3% of the Indigenous people that are in the hospitals make an actual complaint. So I know that right and center.
I think that speaks to kind of why we started doing this Stride Advocacy Project, is this realization that the complaint places that do exist, aside from the Human Rights Commission, are not spaces that really allow people to be heard. People don't feel safe going to. But I've also felt over the years that this idea of collective action on issues, so that's why I like with Lethbridge, for example, we're collecting all the complaints. We're really working to document and collect it all, and then we take the next step. Because when we also submit all our individual ones, they can get lost. So if we as collectives, as civil society, really mobilize and document and really do this in a strategic way, like we're doing in Slave Lake, my prayer is that it will happen. Because even if Slave Lake is the health system, we know that's an issue here. I know it's an issue down in Lethbridge. The more that we can document that and bring that forward, maybe the more pull we can have. So that is our hope. So I thank you for listening.
I just want to talk a little bit about membership. The election law, it divides our people. There's so much. We have different groups here and there, and this was brought to us made in 1985. Bill C-31, we had a white chief here. And it was made, you say custom election law, but, and then it always goes down to the courts, and the courts dictate to us. Even human rights complaints, it always gets sent back to our community for us to be worked on. We try to work on it, it goes for ratification, a vote, but it never ever gets passed. So we spend a lot of money on this, and I'd rather have everybody in. I'd rather just rip up that election law, and it's hard. It's a struggle being a leader. The division, and the hate amongst our community. How do we get together? Unify. So, we still have cases, and if we work on it, are we wasting more dollars? So it's a struggle. So I know we need help in that. We can get another go at it. And I lived it. It hurt me. It hurt others around me. It continues to hurt people and family. And how do you come to agree? How do you agree to disagree?
Takes a lot of work. Yeah. Yeah, and human rights applies, on nations now, as Cam is saying. What's interesting is it's kind of coming from outside, like the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And I think the remedy mechanisms around with First Nations is something that needs to evolve. But if there's always those barriers, I wish I knew it better so I could understand and walk that journey better. I've had a lot of people come to me over the years with human rights complaints that they wanted to file against their band. And it's always been this really interesting conversation of where's that fit and how do we do that in the right way, that we're not also using mechanisms that are your own sovereign mechanisms as well. It's really interesting. So, yeah. Thank you.
Once again, one more question and then we'll move on. Elder? Well, two more questions and then we'll move on.
My name is George Joel.
Hi, George.
And I've been around the block for a few days. I'm 73 years old. And I've heard things that happened to our nations over the past 70 years by my grandparents. And policies that have been done to the top coming down to us. And I question the fact that when are we going to stand up and say no to these policies? When are we going to make our own policies that they have to abide by? We say we are sovereign, and yet we're listening to the Indian Act. We say we're going to do this, but then we stop every time and get on that train, the colonialism, the train that's going by here, our reserve. Chief and council are riding that train. And yet the people are abiding by this colonial system. When are we going to do something with our policies? What's wrong with us making our own policies so whereas that we don't have to jump on a bandwagon to go and listen to their policies? There's no end to this thing here, the way it's being spoken about. Our rights as a treaty person, then a person. The grandmother that I've known for 80 some odd years that she passed away, 93 years old, said to me in Dennet, is that these policies that the white man makes on your behalf is not for you, he says. It's not in the best interest of your people. You have a right to make your own policies, whereas that you can live in harmony with the outside. It's none of your business that they make a policy, because you're capable of making your own policies. When are we going to do this? Thank you.
Like this gentleman said, I'm in the voting policy change. There's a lot of internal work that has to happen, it sounds like, and that's hard. I thank you for that. I appreciate it. Okay.
Hi, I'm First Nations member. On this, your presentation, Alberta.ca, and I noticed it's Alberta.ca. How ironic it is that you never mentioned missing women and children, Indigenous, and that's a big thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
The justice system, our healthcare, and our education. I lived in Edmonton most of my life, over 6 years old. But moving to Lake the last 4 months, I have been receiving discrimination. I happened to be at the hospital a few weeks ago because I was sick. And the first thing they asked me was, do you take drugs?
And that can be found in the Alberta Human Rights Commission.
Yeah,
Right there. Right there.
Because I'm Aboriginal, I've never had that before in my life until I came.
It's common. Yeah. And because it's never challenged to them in any ways. The Alberta Health Services is like this mammoth that nobody really touches.
So the thing is that I when asked them, because of my Aboriginal, why are you asking me that question? So when this happens to me, I tend to get very, I stick up for myself.
Understand.
And I ask the questions back, why are you asking me those questions? Because I'm Aboriginal, you think I have to have drugs?
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. And around the scene where Indigenous thing is, it does come up. Down in Standoff, we worked really hard with them around sexual exploitation capacity building too, because even just knowing what to do, seeing the signs, and just having these spaces where we can talk about these things and be open and safe about them. So those issues have come up. I think I'm just highlighting ones that were just really prominent for us right now.
And for another thing, there is a lot of groups in Alberta that are against the discrimination against women.
Yeah.
And there's a Canada in our children.
Yeah.
So you can probably, like you said, you need to reach
Build relationships. Yeah. What I'm trying to do every day. Yeah.
And if you're the law enforcement, it's a big circle.
It is. Vicious one. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that.